In the dusty corner of a roadside diner off Route 31, a slice of pie wasn't just dessert, it was a signal. And a napkin tucked just right under a salt shaker, that meant a life-or-death message was ready for pickup. In the Cold War, even ketchup bottles weren't always innocent. Welcome to one of the strangest and most unsuspecting outposts in American espionage, a diner off the highway frequented by truckers, families, and, unknowingly, spies. This is the story of how a Soviet asset operating deep in the American heartland selected a small-town eatery as his dead-drop site, leveraging coffee refills, daily specials, and bored waitresses to outmaneuver the FBI for years. This wasn't Berlin, this was Nebraska, and it worked until it didn't. Yuri Mikhailov was not the kind of man who drew second glances, and that was by design. In 1973, he crossed into the United States from Canada under the name Edward Langley, a quiet, middle-aged Alberta native with a fabricated backstory and a meticulously crafted paper trail that the KGB had spent 5 years assembling. His passport passed muster, his accent was diluted by years of preparation, and his demeanor was so devoid of personality that even those who knew him well, neighbors, co-workers, the local postman, struggled to remember what his voice sounded like. Yuri settled in a small town outside of Lincoln, Nebraska, blending seamlessly into a world of grain silos, tractor repair, and potluck Sundays. He bought a small auto repair shop with cash, no financing, no paper trail beyond the essentials, and lived in a modest 2-bedroom bungalow with faded yellow siding and a rusted porch swing that creaked in the wind. The townsfolk knew him as Eddie, the quiet mechanic who worked long hours, charged fair prices, and always had a thermos of black coffee in his hand. He attended church every other Sunday, enough to be seen, but not enough to stand out, and brought apple pie to the annual county fair. To the untrained eye, Yuri was the epitome of rural Americana, a man who preferred the hum of an engine to the buzz of conversation. But beneath that plaid shirt and oil-stained fingernails was a courier for the Soviet Union's most secretive division, the Illegals Program. A network of deep-cover agents trained to live and think like Americans, to breathe the same air and listen to the same news while funneling intelligence back to Moscow without detection. Unlike field operatives who handled classified documents or sabotage missions, Yuri's task was subtler, transporting microfilm, encoded messages, and dead-drop signals between embedded assets across the Midwest. His strength lay not in his intellect or charisma, but in his ability to disappear into the rhythm of American life. He drove a battered Chevy pickup that never exceeded the speed limit, listened to country radio at low volume, and bought groceries every Thursday like clockwork. The local diner knew his order: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, no gravy. And he paid in cash, left a standard tip, and never lingered. If you asked 10 people in town to describe him, you'd get 10 vague answers. Quiet guy, polite, good with transmissions, not much of a talker. And that was the point. Yuri understood that invisibility was not about shadows or disguises, but about mastering the art of consistency. You couldn't be memorable if you were always exactly what people expected you to be. The KGB had taught him that habits were more powerful than secrets, that the best camouflage was the familiar, and so every day he woke up at 5:45, read the local paper, tuned his mind to the heartbeat of Nebraska, and became Edward Langley again. The spy who never once looked like a spy. Baxter's Diner didn't look like much from the outside, and that was exactly what Yuri Mikhailov had been searching for. A place that whispered forgettable comfort in the American vernacular, not one that shouted for attention. The faded neon sign that blinked open in irregular pulses, the chipped vinyl booths, and the creaky aluminum screen door that banged softly every time a trucker walked in for eggs and hash at 2 p.m. All of it added up to a location nobody would write home about, and that made it perfect. Positioned roughly halfway between Omaha and Lincoln, it was just off a stretch of Route 31 that locals used to bypass congested interstates, but that tourists rarely found. The nearest attractions were a gas station, a boarded-up feed store, and a half-empty motel with flickering vacancy signage. To the average commuter, Baxter's was just another grease-stained dot on the roadside map, a place to grab coffee on long drives through cornfields. But to Yuri, it was a godsend of operational potential. Its location provided not only proximity to two major urban centers, brimming with federal contractors and military-adjacent workers, but also a reliable rhythm of silence and slowness. The lunch rush came like clockwork between noon and 1, a procession of regulars whose habits rarely changed, and the late afternoons dipped into a near hibernation state that allowed for inconspicuous dead-drop pickups. Even better, the diner's structure played into the KGB's training manual like a scene built from their own operational guidelines. A back exit that led into an alley hidden from the main road, a corner booth in the far end that had a clear line of sight to both the entrance and the kitchen, and an eastern-facing window that reflected the setting sun just enough to obscure a man's face if he sat there during key hours. Yuri conducted his initial assessment across 4 weeks, coming in at different times under different pretexts. Some days about late breakfast, others just coffee and a newspaper, always paying in cash and never initiating small talk. He observed the staff, noting which servers were inattentive and which hovered, which ones worked specific shifts and which ones might have too sharp an eye. He tested the restroom door to see if it could be locked. For more than a few minutes without notice, it could, and he noted how often the trash behind the diner was collected, Wednesdays and Sundays. Every detail was logged mentally, cross-referenced with the training he had received in Smolensk, and compared against other potential sites he'd surveyed. But none had the quiet, camouflage simplicity of Baxter's. He had found it, the perfect location to turn pie and coffee Americana into an intelligence transfer hub. This would be his operational base, not in the shadows of embassies or behind coded phone calls, but in a booth where no one looked twice at the man stirring cream into his mug. The brilliance of Yuri's system was that it didn't rely on technology, encryption, or anything that required power or wires. It relied on ritual, perception, and objects so mundane no one would think twice about them. Within weeks of selecting Baxter's Diner as his drop zone, he began testing subtle signaling methods under the guise of everyday behavior. The system evolved with careful repetition. A napkin folded diagonally and placed upright in the metal dispenser meant drop has been made. A fork turned prongs down on the outer edge of a plate meant observe, surveillance suspected. A matchbook from the front counter placed face down under a salt shaker meant pickup successful, proceed with next transfer. These were gestures that could be explained away 100 different ways to anyone not fluent in the visual language Yuri and his asset used. But for Meadowlark, a mid-level aerospace contractor working out of an unassuming facility near Bellevue, they were gospel. Meadowlark had been recruited the year prior, not for ideological reasons, but for something far more common: money. Mounting debts, a failed marriage, and a gambling habit had made him vulnerable. And when Moscow came knocking via a third-party intermediary, he didn't say no. Yuri trained him slowly and patiently, never in the same place twice. Sometimes at public libraries, sometimes during coincidental overlaps in gas stations or church festivals, always masked behind normalcy. No meetings lasted more than 3 minutes. Yuri taught him how to create dead drops without being seen, rolling documents in waxed paper sealed with gum, tucking them into the hollow shell of a deodorant stick, placing them in the trash bin behind the diner beneath a specific black bag with a corner tear that Yuri had personally marked. For higher-risk transfers, the drop was placed under a loose floorboard in the men's restroom, the one nearest the last stall that had a bolt so rusted it wouldn't latch, perfect for a quick handoff without the risk of someone walking in. Yuri would feign stomach trouble, lock himself in, lift the board, extract the envelope, flush the toilet for cover noise, and walk out wiping his hands with a paper towel like any other patron. Meadowlark, always precisely 24 hours ahead, left the signals via his lunch order and left no trace. To the staff, he was just another customer who liked club sandwiches and read the paper. Nothing about the system was complex on its face, and that's what made it effective. It wasn't trying to hide in shadows. It was hiding in plain daylight, behind ketchup bottles, under greasy napkins, and beneath the clatter of diners who never noticed the man who always left through the back door 5 minutes after finishing his coffee. Baxter's Diner worked not because it was brilliant, but because it was boring, and in the Cold War game of espionage, boring was better than bulletproof. The place exuded the kind of stillness that made it invisible, camouflaged not by shadows or disguises, but by the warm fog of routine, dull, dependable routine. It sat nestled just off Route 31, halfway between nowhere and Nevermind, a place where the coffee was always too hot, the air always smelled faintly of onions and fryer oil, and the jukebox was perpetually broken on track 7. It was a small-town capsule, untouched by urgency, and that made it the perfect habitat for a ghost like Yuri Mikhailov. In towns like these, the residents respected silence like a kind of civic duty. People kept their eyes on their own business, not out of fear, but out of habit, because lives here moved in quiet, predictable loops. Work, supper, church, sleep. Suspicion didn't flourish here. Familiarity did. The diner's staff was a cast of overworked waitresses and underpaid dishwashers who had learned long ago not to ask questions about regulars who tipped in exact change and didn't smile. Yuri, or Eddie as they knew him, was just another face that blurred into the wallpaper. A mechanic with grimy hands, a weathered jacket, and an expression that always looked like he was trying to remember if he'd left the oven on. The manager, a tired man named Curtis, didn't even know Yuri's last name until the FBI knocked years later. Most days, the only people in the diner between 2 and 4 were long-haul truckers scarfing down meatloaf and retirees nursing lukewarm tea. Nobody paid attention to who came in through the front door or slipped quietly out the back. Especially not in a place where the local sheriff's department consisted of 3 part-timers and a German shepherd that slept more than it barked. The nearest FBI office was 40 miles away in Omaha, and they rarely poked around unless someone robbed a bank or shot up a VFW hall, which hadn't happened in over a decade. Surveillance cameras were practically non-existent, and Baxter's had no reason to install one unless someone started stealing the napkin dispensers, which no one ever did. The real brilliance of the system was how little Yuri had to do to make it run. The environment took care of the rest. Dead drops didn't look suspicious when the man retrieving them always carried a toolbox. A signal didn't stand out when it was disguised as an extra mustard bottle on the edge of a table. In Baxter's, the background noise of clinking cutlery, sizzling griddles, and murmured conversations was enough to drown out 100 subtle acts of espionage. No one asked why Yuri always sat in the same booth. No one cared that he always left within 18 minutes of arriving. And that indifference, pure, sweet, sleepy indifference, was the closest thing to operational perfection a Soviet spy could ask for on American soil. His name was Paul Rutledge on paper, born in Sioux City, Iowa, and employed as a systems integration analyst for a mid-tier defense subcontractor based out of Bellevue, Nebraska. But to the Soviets he was Meadowlark, a quietly unraveling cog in the American war machine who had traded ideology for solvency. Paul had once been a promising engineer with security clearance and a clean record, but after a nasty divorce, crippling gambling debts, and a failed promotion bid, his life had slipped into quiet resentment and isolation. The KGB never needed to coerce him, they just needed to find him. A discreet offer, made via a carefully crafted intermediary, posing as a consultant at a conference in Des Moines, had been all it took. Paul had been disillusioned and ready. The arrangement was simple. Every Tuesday, without exception, he would drive down to Baxter's Diner, where he was just another bleary-eyed customer on his lunch break, and order a club sandwich and a root beer. He always sat in the 3rd booth, from the window, never the 4th, and always left a $1.50 tip, no matter the bill. But the real delivery came not with the food, but in what he left behind. After using the restroom, Paul would tuck a sealed envelope, no markings, folded once, secured with a single paperclip, into the hollow underside of a broken paper towel dispenser, which Yuri had earlier loosened with a concealed screwdriver. That dispenser had been overlooked by maintenance for months and was perfect for dead drops. 10 minutes later, Yuri would enter under the guise of a customer craving bacon and eggs, wait precisely 3 minutes, and excuse himself to the restroom. He would retrieve the envelope calmly, never rushing, tuck it into the lining of his jacket behind a sewn-in pocket, and return to finish his coffee, which he always left half full as part of his exit ritual. To the staff, Yuri was a quiet regular, the kind who nodded but never spoke more than a few words. To Paul, he was an enigma, his handler, yes, but also his mirror, another man buried under layers of masks, moving through routines that never allowed room for error or emotion. The contents of Paul's deliveries varied, sometimes blueprints, sometimes signal protocols, sometimes lists of personnel tied to black-budget satellite operations. always valuable, always encrypted by hand beforehand, and always the product of a man who had stopped believing in what he was protecting. What made Paul especially dangerous wasn't just his access, it was how unremarkable he was. He blended so well into the gray hum of bureaucracy that no one, not even his own manager, suspected that the man hunched over workstation 6 was selling America's secrets one paper towel dispenser at a time. And that was what the Soviets had counted on, that the rot, when hidden well enough, would never smell until it was far too late. The man who cracked open the quiet perfection of Baxter's Diner didn't even know what he was looking at first. His name was Daniel Keene, a 34-year-old signals analyst with the National Security Agency who was on an extended cross-country drive after burning out from 2 consecutive rotations at Fort Meade. He wasn't on assignment. He wasn't even supposed to be thinking about intelligence work. But once trained in counter-surveillance, those instincts rarely shut off. On a humid September afternoon in 1982, Keene pulled into Baxter's off Route 31, looking only for coffee and a clean restroom. The place was nearly empty, save for a middle-aged man sitting alone at the far end, a worn flannel shirt and grease-darkened hands marking him as some kind of blue-collar regular. Keene barely registered him until he noticed something odd. The man kept glancing at the window's reflection, not out of paranoia, but with rhythmic precision, as though measuring the flow of time by who came and went. And then, after sipping precisely half his coffee, the man rose and made his way to the restroom. Not unusual, except Keene caught the briefest moment of hesitation at the door, a calculated pause, like someone waiting for a cue. 5 minutes later, the man re-emerged, walked straight to the counter, paid in cash, and left without a word. Something in that pattern gnawed at Keene. It was subtle, but it didn't fit. The over-awareness, the precision, the way he seemed more attuned to the room than part of it. And then there was the timing. Within a minute of the man leaving, another customer entered, headed straight to the same restroom, and stayed there less than 2 minutes before disappearing out the back exit. Keene's blood ran cold. He'd spent years studying Soviet tradecraft, and this felt like a page out of their manual. No direct contact, staggered entries, the use of public places for timed drops. Most civilians would have dismissed it, but Keene knew what patterns looked like when they weren't just habits. They were procedures. He jotted down the license plate of the flannel-wearing man's truck as it rumbled away and called in a tip to the FBI field office in Omaha later that evening, cloaking his identity under a fake name, but making it clear. You have an active courier working out of a diner between Lincoln and Omaha. He's trained, he's operational, and he's not American. The Bureau, at first skeptical, flagged the tip, ran the plate, and found a ghost. Edward Langley, with no criminal record, minimal digital footprint, and no known associates. 2 weeks later, a formal surveillance operation was approved. Within days, agents posing as truckers and farmers began rotating shifts inside Baxter's. They started small logging patterns, timestamps, restroom visits, even napkin arrangements. It didn't take long for them to realize something Daniel Keene had spotted in a single cup of coffee. This wasn't just a man. This was a method, and it was working, until now. The FBI, cautious not to waste resources on a hunch, but equally unwilling to ignore a potential Soviet breach, greenlit what they called Operation Saltstone, an observation and confirmation phase centered around Baxter's Diner that began in quiet coordination with the Omaha field office, and under direct orders from Washington's Counterintelligence Division. They didn't yet know if they were dealing with an active Soviet asset or a misfired paranoia from an off-duty analyst, but the setup was precise and discreet. Technicians installed 3 micro cameras, one aimed at the rear alley trash bins, another tucked into a dislodged ceiling panel above the men's restroom, and the last, a fiber optic pinhole lens, buried within a ventilation grate positioned to capture activity near the corner booth. An audio bug was placed behind the broken paper towel dispenser after a staged plumbing inspection forced a brief closure of the restroom, during which time Bureau agents posing as contractors made the modifications without alerting the diner's owner. Over the next 3 weeks, agents rotated in and out of the establishment posing as weary salesmen, farmers with frostbitten hands, or cross-country drivers, all of them armed with concealed radios and trained eyes. What they captured confirmed the worst-case scenario. The man known locally as Edward Langley was conducting sophisticated, well-practiced drops. On 3 separate Tuesdays, he entered the diner during the same afternoon hour, sat in the same booth, ordered the same meal, and used the restroom at the same point in his routine, each time exiting moments later with a slightly bulkier jacket or an uneven gait that betrayed concealed weight. The second week yielded a breakthrough. Audio equipment recorded a soft rustling behind the restroom wall panel, followed by the unmistakable snap of a tape-sealed envelope. The following day, agents retrieved the trash bin contents with forensic gloves and extracted a thin manila envelope containing what initially appeared to be personal photographs. But after close analysis at FBI headquarters, those photographs revealed high-resolution black and white images of military-grade topographic satellite arrays, annotated with notes scrawled in pen, and bearing watermarks from a defense contractor known to work under NSA subcontracts. These were not casual leaks. They were the kind of documents that required security clearance, internal access, and a sophisticated chain of exfiltration. The images were crisp, focused, and marked with date stamps no older than 10 days, which confirmed that not only were these live operations being compromised, but the leak was timely and consistent. Even more alarming was the nature of the documentation. These weren't blurry surveillance grabs or stolen dossiers. They were deliberate captures, almost certainly the product of internal access, and someone on the inside was not only cooperating with the courier, but producing classified material on a regular basis. That shifted the Bureau's posture from passive observation to active containment. It was no longer a question of if, but who, and the priority became not just catching the courier in the act, but tracing the breach all the way back to the source buried somewhere inside America's own war machine. Once the FBI confirmed that the photographs in the dead drop matched classified materials originating from a Department of Defense subcontractor facility in Bellevue, the investigation narrowed with surgical focus. The array blueprints had originated in a secure data room, accessible by only 11 employees, all with Tier 3 clearance, and cross-referencing badge swipe logs with internal surveillance footage quickly isolated one name that didn't sit right: Paul Rutledge. Rutledge had accessed the sensitive satellite data 2 days before the FBI intercepted the dead drop, and his movement patterns matched timestamps eerily close to previous Tuesday lunch hours in Lincoln, Nebraska, 43 miles away from his workplace. A deeper dive into his background painted a picture ripe for compromise: recently divorced, court-ordered alimony payments, a maxed-out credit card tied to an off-the-books gambling parlor in Council Bluffs, and a quiet demotion 6 months prior that left him embittered and invisible in the company ranks. His web history, financial statements, and the frequency of his Tuesday lunch breaks all pointed to one conclusion: Rutledge was the leak. But instead of kicking down his door, the FBI made a choice: pressure, not prosecution. Special Agent Maren Goodwin, a counterintelligence specialist with a reputation for converting assets, approached him outside his apartment in late October. She wasn't in a suit. She dressed like a neighbor, leaned against his car with calm authority, and told him, plainly, that she knew what he was doing and how much time he'd serve if he didn't cooperate. Rutledge paled, stammered, tried denial, but when she showed him the surveillance photo of him placing the envelope under the dispenser, his shoulders collapsed. They didn't need a confession. They needed a controlled operation. The plan was deceptively simple. Rutledge would continue as if nothing had changed. He would prepare a fake document packet, assembled by the Bureau's forensic forgery unit, impeccably realistic, but laced with the forensic markers and falsified data designed to trip up any foreign analysis. He would make the drop on the scheduled Tuesday at the scheduled time, under the exact same procedures he had used for over a year. Only this time, he would be wearing a wire. Every movement, every muttered word, every second of that diner visit would be monitored live from 2 surveillance vans and 3 undercover agents posing as cheatamers. Rutledge agreed, visibly shaken but cooperative, with the quiet dread of a man watching the trap he once fed, now snap back on his handler. The Bureau wasn't interested in a mid-level analyst desperate for cash. They wanted the man who picked up the envelope, the courier they now knew as the linchpin of a deeper Soviet network. If all went according to plan, they would catch him in the act, red-handed, in possession of classified materials, in the middle of nowhere. Meadowlark, the quiet trader with the club sandwich and the dead eyes, was about to become the sharpest weapon in the FBI's Cold War arsenal. All he had to do was walk into Baxter's diner one more time and pretend everything was still exactly the same. The snow came early that year, dusting the roads outside Baxter's diner with a powdery white that muffled the world and made every footstep sound like it mattered. December 14th, 1982, a Tuesday naturally, began like any other for Yuri Mikhailov, known in the Midwest as Edward Langley, the silent mechanic who preferred booths to counters and never needed more than one refill of coffee. He arrived at 2:11 p.m. sharp, same battered Chevy pickup, same faded denim coat, same nondescript ball cap pulled low over his brow. The diner was quiet, as it always was at that hour, and nothing felt out of place. He nodded at the waitress behind the counter, who flashed the subtle signal, a single touch of the sugar jar, the code for drop confirmed. She wasn't the usual girl, but Yuri noticed nothing amiss. Turnover in places like this was expected, and her manner was practiced enough to pass. The sting operation was already in full swing. 2 agents posing as truckers nursed Black. Coffee in the front corner, a third wore a delivery uniform and pretended to struggle with a busted receipt printer. And Maren Goodwin herself sat in a rental sedan across the street, headset crackling with every tick of the wire tape beneath Paul Rutledge's rib cage. Rutledge had already come and gone, leaving the bathroom occupied for 5 minutes and slipping the decoy envelope into the hollow base of the towel dispenser, just as he'd been trained. And Yuri, punctual to the edge of pathology, rose from his booth at 2:16 and moved toward the restroom with the precision of a man whose entire survival depended on never deviating from routine. The envelope, when he retrieved it, felt just like the others, sealed, tight, real. It was fake, of course, a forgery of classified documents meticulously constructed to lure a Soviet courier into indisputable criminal possession, each page laced with invisible fibers and microtags that could be used in court to trace their origin. Yuri tucked the envelope into the seam of his coat, flushed the toilet without using it, washed his hands, and walked out like he always did. But this time, 6 men were waiting. The clatter of cutlery ceased, the snow outside continued to fall, and Yuri's eyes met the nearest badge without flinching. "Edward Langley," one of the agents said, "you're under arrest for espionage against the United States." There was no struggle, no surprise. Yuri's face remained impassive, and he raised his hands with the grace of a man who knew the moment would come, eventually. They cuffed him beside the gum machine near the register, beneath a corkboard filled with church announcements and lost dog posters. As they led him out into the cold, his boots leaving faint impressions in the snow, the waitress, now visibly trembling, watched the man vanish who'd sat at that corner booth for over 2 years. Yuri didn't look back. He didn't need to. The mission was over. The silence he'd so carefully constructed had finally been broken, and somewhere far away, in Moscow's damp corridors, a red file was being quietly closed. Yuri Mikhailov, Soviet courier, deep cover operative, and the man once known in Nebraska as Edward Langley, refused to say a single word after his arrest. No denials, no negotiations, no names, not even to confirm his real identity. During interrogation sessions at a federal facility outside Washington, D.C., he sat stone-faced behind the thick glass, meeting every question with a blank stare that rattled even the most seasoned agents. Polygraphs yielded nothing. His heart rate never spiked, his expression never shifted, and he passed every test with the practiced stillness of a man who'd spent a lifetime training to outlast pressure. The FBI eventually charged him under Title 18 of the U.S. Code for conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States. And though the evidence, surveillance footage, physical possession of classified materials, forensic analysis of the envelope was more than enough to convict, Yuri never spoke in his own defense. The trial was closed to the source, public, and conducted under the veil of national security, and in July 1983, he was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. But he would serve just under 3. In March of 1986, with tensions flaring once again in Europe and back-channel negotiations heating up, Yuri's name appeared on a list of prisoners the KGB was willing to exchange for 2 American operatives held in East Germany. The deal was conducted in absolute secrecy and finalized in Berlin, where Yuri was quietly walked across the Glienicke Bridge in the early morning hours of April 9th, a drizzling Wednesday. No press, no ceremony, just the sound of footsteps and the exchange of silent nods as agents passed each other mid-bridge, ghosts returning home. After his departure, Baxter's Diner tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, its remaining staff oblivious to the specifics, but uneasily aware that something larger than their little town had passed through their doors. Business declined gradually as stories began to circulate about the man in the flannel who never missed a Tuesday and the government vans that had parked down the street. Customers whispered over pie and coffee about spy cameras in the ceiling, about mysterious packages found in the men's restroom, about the waitress who vanished a week after the arrest and was never seen again. Over time, the diner lost its regulars and the booth sat empty longer and longer until, in March '94, it closed for good. The building was sold, repurposed as a bait-and-tackle shop, and later demolished entirely. It wasn't until 2012, under the Freedom of Information Act, that parts of the operation, codenamed Saltstone, were declassified, and the full scope of the case came to light. Redacted reports, grainy photos, and FBI memos painted a picture of just how fragile the barrier between normalcy and espionage could be. What once seemed like a sleepy stretch of rural America was revealed to be the front line of a shadow war, fought not with guns, but with napkins, matchbooks, and envelopes. The story of Yuri Mikhailov became a quiet case study in counterintelligence circles, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemies weren't found in bunkers or briefings, but sitting alone in a diner, sipping coffee in plain sight. If you found this story as chilling and fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who thinks spycraft only happens in movies. Cold War secrets were hidden in plain sight, and this is just one of them. More true espionage stories are coming soon. Stay tuned.